the seminar is going to be about modeling and framing. So I'm just going to share my screen so that I can take some nice notes for everyone to take a look at while I do this. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah? Just like one verbal yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
It has trees.
Incredible. Yeah, it does. So I'm just going to take notes in this doc, but it doesn't really matter, just so you guys can follow along. So can anyone just give me a definition of modeling and framing and what sets them apart and what they have in common?
I think generally modeling is done at the beginning of the debate. Mm-hmm. Usually, like, the prime minister has to do it, and then I guess if you're like on opposition, you can also counter model, but that's just for fun. And then framing is sort of explaining your stance and the way you want the judge to sort of see the world, like explaining the way you're looking at the round.
So so one is a lot more subjective, right? So generally when you're modeling, you're giving specific implementation details, how your policy is going to work, what parameters are involved. So for example, if we're giving a universal basic income, how much money are we giving to people? How are we distributing it, right? So those types of questions, what are parameters, edge cases, etc. The goal of modeling is to remove ambiguity, right? You get a motion, there are aspects of it that are confusing, you want to make things unambiguous. The thing about modeling is that it is supposed to be non-contentious. So it should be stuff that like a reasonable person on both teams would generally agree should be how the debate is framed to be a fair and balanced debate. It is generally not designed in a way that is like purely strategic for your team. Obviously, if you have many valid models, you can choose the one that is best for you, but modeling is generally supposed to at least appear impartial. And in a good debate, teams are not going to be challenging the model. So that's like the key distinction of modeling. In contrast, so I will say teams in a good debate don't challenge the model. You know, debates where people are constantly remodeling, they happen, but those debates suck and they're not fun to watch or judge, and it's the PM's fault for not being better. So framing, in contrast, is similar in that you're building up a world and you're sort of setting parameters, but it's about setting parameters that are more subjective and you expect to be contentious. So for example, let's say that I was, let's say that I was banning gambling, right? So modeling would be a definition of like what gambling is literally and how this law would work. So for example, modeling would be where I say that like roulette counts as gambling, but buying stocks does not count as gambling, right? And I'd have to have some principled reason why that is the case. For example, one thing might be like risk taking becomes gambling when there's like a house edge, which doesn't exist in the stock market generally because you have like a average, you'll like earn 10% on your investment or something like that. So I'd have some relatively unambiguous, non-contentious model, but I would also have framing, which is like, this is where I sort of characterize, we've already defined what gambling literally is, but from my point of view, what does gambling like represent, sort of? Who does it prey on? Who are the types of people that are likely to engage in it? What is the mindset of casinos in general? And so it's sort of where you provide like subjective context that explains where like the round is coming from in a way that is somewhat biased towards your side. So my brain is at the motion that we're setting for practice because I just ran it with my high schoolers to make sure it would go well. But generally you're sort of coming up with subjective like concepts and your arguments will then play into it. So framing would also include principles that underlie your argument. So for example, if I'm saying we're going to ban casinos once again, part of my framing is saying like when do we ban something? When do what principles justify the government in taking that action, and then I would build my arguments based on those principles. So partially setting up these principles are a type of setup that you do that are going to be contentious. Teams might disagree on like what principles are legitimate towards banning something, but it's generally in the purpose of setting up the debate in a way that clearly states how you view the world. So both modeling and framing are setting up the debate clearly, but modeling is sort of this objective thing that is just based on like literal definitions, and framing is a lot more subjective. It's a lot more based on how your team subjectively views the world, and like is a lot more contentious. Generally though, these things can be interwoven through the speech. So modeling is usually done literally at the top. You're like, this is exactly how we're implementing this. And framing is something that sort of comes through in your arguments and isn't often done literally. Like a lot of teams will do framing without saying that they're framing. But also sometimes teams will weave it together. Like they'll say, we're like modeling it this way because of this underlying principle that we stand for. And that's like one way that people will do both. So are those like definitions clear enough that we can go on to some interactive examples? I hope so.
Yes, they are.
Brilliant. They're supposed to be. So, okay. So the idea now is we're just gonna take random motions on Hello Motions, and we're gonna talk about modeling and framing and how you as a PM speaker would model and frame these things. For example, this is a random motion. This house supports the kingpin strategy and combating drug cartels. Before we go into actually modeling, I always think it's important to, before answering questions, figure out what questions you need to ask in the first place. So could someone tell me what questions need to be answered in the model to this motion? Any thoughts?
Like, I guess there would be an info slide here on what the kingpin strategy is, yes?
It is here. The kingpin strategy was employed by the Mexican government and focused on targeting and hunting down leaders of drug cartels in an effort to topple them.
We have to define what this house is, like what the scope of the debate is.
Yeah, so who is the house or actor? So like, I guess you could say Mexican government and limit that scope because the info slide sort of sets it up that way. But you could also say this is just a general strategy that you deal with in any country. This is where you sort of get into like framing stuff, which is not as literal, but like what countries tend to be countries with like massive drug cartels. And obviously the way the debate plays out is different in different countries. You might want to like frame that. Yeah, so who is the house? What else may you want to ask?
Like what the situation like looks like in the status quo, and like what like hunting down leaders would actually constitute in your world.
Yeah, exactly. What are some things that are like kind of ambiguous in this motion that like might be unclear or might be like contested between teams, unless explicitly modeled? So like, for example, one thing I might ask is like what constitutes leadership? So what I mean by this is like, obviously like cartels might have one big leader, but like if I target the person directly under the leader, I feel like that's still sufficiently close to the principle. So maybe you set up a comparative where you're like, are we generally focusing on going after the people that are at the relative top of an organization versus like foot soldiers, right? So you might also want to set up like, what is the comparative? And what is comparative? E.g., what's up?
I would also say like what kind of like characterizing what the power structures look like, and like to what extent these leaders like actually influence like what happens like further down that tree.
Yeah, exactly. So what does the power structure look like, and what is the role of kingpins? So notice that this question that Lucille brilliantly asked, because it's very dead on. Someone has their mic on, I think. No? Can't tell, but someone, whoever has like construction going on, thank you, whoever that was, brilliant. Sorry about that. Yeah, so this question is not necessary to answer in order to define the motion, but it is necessary in order to put the arguments that you're about to make into context. So, and it could probably be contentious, because I think different teams might have different perceptions of how important these kingpins are. For example, a gov team might want to argue that kingpins are like super crucial to the functioning of these organizations, and the op side might say, actually, like, these people are replaceable. As soon as you take one out, someone will fill in their position. You know, if you create a power vacuum, it'll be filled. And so there's probably going to be contention over this, but it's still important to clarify. And so this is an example of like framing instead of modeling, and sort of like how you're going to set up the debate. And it's important to do that in order for any of your following arguments to make sense. Other things you'd want to clarify, other thoughts?
I mean, like, I guess this is like a bit less important, but like what sort of, like, what your goal is at the end of the day, right? Because like the motions or the info slide says like in an effort to topple them. So like what is your goal, and like how is that going to like affect like like what are you trying to do, and what are the criteria for having achieved that, I guess?
No, fully. Yeah. So an important point of framing and like all rounds are what your goals are. Once again, goals is something that are not necessary to understand in order to know like literally what the debate is about. So that's more framing than modeling. But understanding what goals we're trying to achieve with all of our arguments is really important to weighing all of the team's arguments. And it's also important to beating your back half, because if you're able to say the goal of like fighting drug cartels or X, Y, and Z criteria, and then you create arguments that satisfy all of those things, you don't leave that much wiggle room for back half to come in and like add to that. You've already proven the most important things in the round. So establishing what your goal is like super important. Yeah, I think these are like a reasonable set of like questions, and I would encourage you to do this sort of thing with your partner when you're prepping, especially on PM, but also in back half, especially because a lot of the time what an extension will look like is just new framing that enables you to then put arguments into the round that otherwise wouldn't work. So ask your partner, like, who does this acronym to you? Like, what does the status quo look like? Like all these questions that are listed. I think sometimes debate rewards answering questions more than it rewards answering questions well. So judges generally don't, like, at least in my experience, judges often will decide rounds based on what teams like at least tried to prove more than things that they were able to prove, because often most debates will have claims that are just like never even attempted to be proven. So like if one team at least says what a reasonable goal might be and explains with some reasonable mechanism how they solve that goal, then that team is still better than one that doesn't do any framing whatsoever and doesn't actually like explain those things. So I think like these are difficult questions to answer, but generally, if you ask all of them and answer them in some way that is at least reasonable, even if it's not incredible or galaxy brained or like super spec heavy, you're still probably going to do relatively well in the round. So like stay optimistic is the point of that like long thing that I just went on. Yeah, so now that we've asked the questions, let's try answering them. So someone tell me, who do you think you'd set the actor as?
The Mexican government.
Sure, Mexican government. Why?
Because it was defined in the info slide. Mexico has a pretty big drug cartel problem, so it's like a reasonable scope for the debate.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's like a reasonable intuition. The only thing I would say is like I don't think that the motion explicitly says that clearly. It says that the kingpin strategy was employed by the Mexican government, but not necessarily that it was unique to the Mexican government. So for example, I don't know, like floating your currency is something that might be like something that like, I don't know, one country does, but it's not necessarily unique to that country. Other countries could also do it. You know, Colombia could also adopt the kingpin strategy. So even though like the info slide just talks about Mexico, I would generally say that you want to like expand it as much as possible. So Mexican government is fine. Like I don't think you'd like be docked points if you modeled it that way. But you might also want to just say like, you know, like governments in countries with large or powerful drug cartels. So like, you know, which is especially prevalent in South and Central America, but also could exist in other countries. So it's sort of this like general rule for like the types of governments we're talking about, and like sort of limiting the scope. But yeah, that's a good way of framing it. Sure. Let's see. What does the status quo look like? I think actually this is kind of similar to the second question. Like, what do you think the comparative likely is? We gave one example. Like, how does this distinguish itself from that type of policy?
Oh, wait, can people hear me? My mic is like super weird today.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, thanks. I was actually in that round. I think like, I don't know, like the comparative to like the op round, just like mostly just like first of all, like are like targeting lower level, like people who are like engaging in drug trade and stuff like that, or they're like trying to take those leaders to court. Is like another example is that you still target higher level leader, but then it's like you try to like go through legal mechanism and stuff like that.
Yeah, instead of killing them. Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So you're explaining what the comparative is, and then you might say like specifically, we instead focus on arresting higher ups. Yeah, I think that's like relatively
Jacob.
clear. Yeah.
I just have a question here. So like, I mean, those are like two like kind of different comparatives that you could pick as like an open and go team, like either like targeting like lower level foot soldiers or like using legal mechanisms. And like one of those is probably going to be like a more desirable comparative for you than the other. So like, how do you identify that here?
Okay, so that's a really good question. I think because this is generally like a modeling point, I would go towards the first one. And the reason is as follows. I think when you say like hunting down leaders of cartels, the fact that you're doing this illegally is kind of unclear. Like you could definitely say that like cops are like hunting down a murderer. And so I think that the wording that is implied could encompass any number of legal means. I think if you were to model it as including like you allow yourself to do like legal prosecution, I think you're definitely muddying the waters of what your side has to defend. And generally when you're modeling a debate, you want to take on like a reasonably high burden, and saying we can do something that is very close to this policy but slightly different is generally not that good. So I think you probably want to make the comparative about targeting lower level foot soldiers and say that's what opposition is defending, rather than opposition is targeting, instead of putting these people in jail for life, we're going to murder them. Like, I don't know if that's as much of a reasonable comparative as set up in the debate. Does it make sense? Sorry.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, what might you say that the role of kingpins are when you're on government? This is like framing. Like, what do you think is a useful thing? If you're going after them, what do you want to say their role might be? Zach.
Yeah, I think you wanna do like a top-down approach. I mean, like that's the way you want to explain it. You want to say how like the information's not everywhere. Like you want to explain people know things that like you need to know to run the business, don't share with other people.
Yeah.
How like they're highly competent and like they're like amazing organizers and they know how to like that kind of stuff. Instead of talking about
So the interesting thing is you're sort of using this weird form of psychology when you're doing framing, right? When you're saying all these things, you're not really like making an argument yet, but it's like very clear how it will segue into an argument. And I think like because you're just sort of stating these things as facts and like characterizing these people in a sort of like at least like nominally objective way, it's a lot more like credible. And then when you go into your arguments, these assumptions that you're making are sort of already established. It becomes a lot easier. So yeah, that's huge. And then what might you say your goal is when you're targeting cartels?
I don't have a raise hand feature, but one for the last, I was thinking that you could also like in some ways say that kingpins are major in expanding like the cartel itself. So like actual expansion processes of like these big criminal organizations take place at the higher levels and not the lower ones, which is like you could kind of convert it into your goal as well, that you want to contain the spread or like to some extent like have sporadic impacts of like reducing some kind of violence that's involved in those expansions when they're taking territory, whatever. So
you want to reduce violence. That's huge. You You probably want to like reduce the organizational capacity of these gangs. I think like ultimately, like when you're defining your like goals, it might be useful to like make these as non-argumentative as possible. So for example, like the idea that you want to like contain cartels and stop them from spreading, like that seems really objective, but I can definitely imagine a team that says like centralized cartels that have a large degree of power are less violent than splintered cartels that need to constantly be fighting with each other for territory. So actually that's not a good goal. And the real direct goal is like reducing violence, reducing the degree of power that they have over governments. So like reducing power cartels hold over governments. Those are like really big key things. And you'd want to establish why when you get rid of these leaders, they're less able to do that. So yeah, so that's like generally how you'd go about the process of modeling this round. Is that like reasonably clear on modeling? Do people feel like they could do that? I can't see anyone, so
yeah.
Lit. Okay. Does that before like I was going to do another example, although I'll check with Maya that slotting is dealt with. Are there any questions that like or specific concerns about doing this that like people want to ask before we go on to another example? Like things that are confusing, or like an example of a debate you maybe dealt with where you didn't know how to model or frame something. Any thoughts? Would people be interested in talking about modeling and framing for the motion we're going to debate in practice today? Or would you prefer to do that independently?
Regardless, we should try to like get to prep and rounds in like 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, I was checking with Maya. I'll message them. Okay. Then I guess we just end the seminar now. And I
wait, sorry, I have one question.
Yeah, sure.
Do we have time? Yeah, just we should have time. So like sometimes like this are regret motion, and sometimes like it's more of a question to be like if you're an op and then like op have this kind of like weird model or like conception of what the counterfactual is, and you just don't really agree, but you don't really know how to contend with it because you also don't know that much about like what it could have been, right?
Yeah, so I guess the question is like, why do you think their counterfactual is unreasonable? Like, you don't necessarily need to have your, so I guess in regrets motions, you always want a counterfactual because otherwise your arguments aren't going to be that comparative. But if you can't do that, it can be like at least better than nothing to have some reason why you think their counterfactual is unreasonable. So if you could just point out some like absurd assumption that they're making, that could generally be helpful. Although I would definitely say that the gold standard is having your own counterfactual and explaining structurally why that counterfactual is more likely. But like you said, like if you're in a situation where you don't know that, I mean, that's not something you could really get over just by like trying your hardest. So yeah, just like think about cases where like what they said is unreasonable, because feasibly, like if you are dubious, there's a reason why you're dubious about what they're saying. So trust your instincts, I guess. Getting a slotting ETA from Maya. Are there other questions? Because we don't really have time to go over a new full example. We're like,
yeah, I have a question.
Nice.
So I'm just wondering what you say in regards to like characterizing these like foot soldiers, right? Because like you're inevitably like going to get probably into like a discussion as to like how it affects them and whether this is like still like a dependable system to them and like whether they're still going to like remain loyal to this like hierarchy and like just like in general like what's going to happen to them. So like I guess like where is the distinction between like the things that you should be characterizing in your framing versus the things that become part of your arguments?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that it's probably like a bit of a chicken and egg problem because your arguments depend on your framing, but also the framing that you choose to focus on depends on your arguments. So generally when I'm doing preparation, the first thing I think about are just like a few reasonable examples of what I think the motion looks like. So I like will talk to my partner. I'll be like, this looks like X, Y, or Z thing. And then I'll think about different ways that it could vary. And I'll try to come up with different arguments that like could impact all of them. And then based on the arguments that my partner and I have come up with, I then think about what model and framing is the most appropriate and most important. And I've spent time framing the things that are important to all of my arguments. So I could definitely imagine making arguments that talk about the role of foot soldiers and their incentives and how they're going to react to certain types of changes. But if I'm not running an argument about that, I'm definitely not going to frame it, right? And then so that's the first thing. And the second thing is just like, it's kind of like, I don't know, I think about this like computer programming, you know, when you have something that is going to apply to the rest of your arguments, you want to pull it out to the top, right? So if this underlying assumption that the goal is to reduce cartel violence or that kingpins look a certain way, then, and all of my arguments are sort of tied back to that idea that like kingpins are like centrally important to planning and organization, and all different arguments then about how planning and organization are important, then that's definitely something I need to explain at the top. But if I only have one argument about foot soldiers and their incentives, and it's not really crucial to other arguments, then it's probably better to just include it in that argument. The real goal is just not to be repeating yourself. If like a lot of arguments rest on an assumption, you don't want to repeat that assumption. So those are the ones that like go at the top of your speech, and then the stuff that is unique to an argument fits in at the end. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Brilliant. So Maya has the slotting. So I guess we're done with the seminar. I will release the motion shortly. Apologies for